the Next Round podcast. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. So we're taping this podcast on Wednesday morning in the immediate aftermath of Tuesday night's results. So with me this morning is Ben Smithwick in Pasadena, PRI's Vice President of Development, Kerry Jackson, who is on the beach in the South Bay Area. He's PRI Fellow on California Studies, and of course, Tim Anaya, Director of Communications out in Sacramento. So in some of these races, especially many of the legislative and congressional races in California, we won't know the final results for weeks, but what we can be sure of is that the Democrats have taken the House and the Senate remains the Republican majority. So with that in mind, what's your major takeaway from Tuesday's results in California?
I don't see any surprises. There's nothing, I don't think anybody really is surprised by the way things turned out in California. Blue state politicians have strengthened their grip on state politics. That would be a slight change. I think they're just centralizing their power, consolidating their power, shall we say. But the problems that the state is experiencing isn't going to go away. They're not going to be solved by this group that we've put back into office. They're only going to grow worse.
I think most of the interesting things happened outside of California. I think we learned that if you were a Democratic senator and voted against Judge Kavanaugh for the Supreme Court, that probably wasn't a good thing for your efforts to get reelected. In California, I think the big takeaway is that the blue wave has been living here for at least a decade now and will continue even stronger with Gavin Newsom and a Democratic supermajority.
Well, I think if you're a Democrat in California, you certainly have a lot to be happy about. Not only did Democrats do pretty well in the state assembly and Senate races, I think they are also poised to have significant roles in leadership and Congress. If you are a Republican in California, on the other hand, I think things probably couldn't be worse. It's possible that the gas tax repeal may have given some Republicans a boost in some of the contested House races in the state, but it's hard to see any bright spots for the GOP. I think part of the problem is demographics, obviously, but it's clear that the party also has some messaging problems. I think the defeat of Prop 6 indicates that maybe tax issues don't play with the electorate like they used to. And I think as Tim had mentioned in our pre-election podcast, this is really an election where money mattered. And I think if Steve Knight and Dana Rohrabacher lose, a large part of it will be due to the money spent, including by Michael Bloomberg, who put over $9 million into the campaign. So I think money has a big factor in it.
So the national result will definitely have a significant impact on several key issues facing California, from taxes and the economy to water policy. So let's go around the table, I would say, but really the state. Talk about the changes in Congress that will impact a key California issue at the federal level that you're watching. How about you, Kerry?
I think what's happened here in California is just going to solidify for the rest of the country its views on California. It's a state of political, shall I say, eccentrics, put it the nicest way I can possible. You're going to have Nancy Pelosi. She's going to be Speaker again, most likely. Maxine Waters running the House Financial Services Committee. Adam Schiff chairing the House Intelligence Committee. And the rest of the U.S. sees this and sees these folks on TV on a daily basis and how they're going to rant and how they're going to carry on. It's just going to confirm their biases or their thoughts on California they've had for decades. It's going to say, they're going to say, yeah, there goes the left coast again. Look at the folks they put up, they keep electing, and now we have to deal with them out of Washington.
How about you, Tim?
Well, I think Kerry's right. I mean, it's going to be very interesting, as it always is, to watch our California congressional members when they get on the national stage in their leadership positions. On issues, there's two that I am fascinated to watch. Number one is Kerry's favorite issue, high-speed rail. And, as Republicans have been in the majority and Trump has been president, especially Jeff Denham and Kevin McCarthy and Devin Nunes being in top leadership positions, it's pretty much been dead when it comes to any additional funding from Washington for high-speed rail in California. But now, after the election, you see that President Trump has taken a conciliatory tone, as is usually the case. When the opposition party wins, we want to work together. And one of the things that's been suggested that they could work together on is infrastructure. And so I'm interested to see when President President Trump negotiates with Nancy Pelosi on infrastructure, how much money, if any, will he agree to for high-speed rail in California? The other interesting one, and again, changing that cast of characters will affect the outcome, is water policy. There's been a real push in the last few months to actually change water policy for the better to benefit farmers and the residents of California over fish, as Democrats have, for large part, been supporting in water policy. Now that we have this change, can we expect any further positive changes to benefit regular Californians, not just environmental interests? I think that's one where you'll see Trump could take executive action, but you're not likely to see any congressional legislation agreed to.
Ben, do you want to add anything?
Sure. I don't really expect to see much change. I think what we'll probably see is a lot of gridlock, and that will probably prevent a lot of major policy changes that could potentially impact the state. With the split control of Congress, I think it's unlikely that either side will want the other side to be able to achieve significant policy victories in various areas. Although one area that I think might be impacted are regulations on technology and social media. There's been a big debate in California over the California Consumer Privacy Act that was passed and signed into law over the summer. And for those who don't know about the law, it was a state law that was modeled after the European Union's regulations designed to protect consumers from data breaches. And some of the big tech companies, a lot of companies based in California, have been pushing for a new federal privacy bill that would essentially preempt the stronger California law. And I think it's unclear what will happen now. And there are also individual races that the tech industry, I think, was watching pretty closely. Republican Senator Marsha Blackburn has been a big opponent of net neutrality, and as has been Ted Cruz, whose opponent's campaign was funded heavily by the tech industry. So I think we'll see both of them having a prominent voice when it comes to social media and censoring free speech. All in all, I think it will be interesting to see how the debates over censorship and data privacy end up playing out in the new Congress.
PRI Sally Pipes has written extensively about the number of Democrats running for Congress, and Governor made single payer a key component of their campaign platforms, and it proved successful in several instances. What did Tuesday's results portend for the future of single payer in California and nationally, and also efforts to repeal and replace Obamacare?
Gavin Newsom is well known as a single payer advocate, but he just isn't. I don't see him being nearly as realistic about the cost as Jerry Brown was. We've seen estimates that's going to more or less triple the budget, or put it this way, it would be double of what the general fund budget is in any given year. From about $200 billion, it's going to cost an added $400 billion. That's a lot of money, and where you're going to get all that. It's going to be back on the table though with Newsom, and we had a single payer bill that it passed the Senate in the summer, but it didn't get anywhere in the Assembly. But it's going to be back on the table, and with Newsom in the governor's mansion, it's going to get more traction than ever.
Tim?
What's most interesting is one of the really big surprises of election 2018 in California. It looks like Ricardo Lara, who was the biggest proponent of single payer in the legislature, has been elected as state insurance commissioner. There's still, for our listeners, as we tape this, there's probably at least a third of the vote to come in from absentee ballots and provisional ballots. But if he ends up winning, and he's leading by a little over 100,000 votes right now, you could argue he won because of single payer. And so that will be very interesting to see, having the top proponent of single payer with a huge platform as insurance commissioner, how that might impact the issue going forward. I think what will be interesting to see is how does Gavin Newsom approach single payer. I think he likes it as a campaign issue. I don't know that he is as big a fan behind the scenes when it comes to something he'll have to legislate and govern with. I'd be very surprised if that's the first thing out of the box that Gavin Newsom and the Democratic supermajority push.
Even Newsom has said that that's probably going to be a multi-year process, even though he has indicated support for it. I think he's probably skeptical about the cost.
He has tamped down expectations of it. That's true. And I agree with Tim, too. I don't think it's going to be the first thing out of the gate, and it's going to take a while. But again, I think it's, as I said before, I think it's going to gain more traction than ever, simply because of his because of Brown's deeper or greater realism about it than I see coming out of Newsom.
Right, and I think looking nationally back to Congress, I think the main goal of Democrats in the House will probably be to stop any further efforts by the president and by Republicans to roll back Obamacare. We heard a lot in a lot of races this year about protections for patients with pre-existing conditions, and there's already a bill in the House actually that would place limitations on short-term plans, which have been criticized, and that would also expand Obamacare's premium subsidies. And as we look at the states that had pretty close elections, we saw ballot measures actually pass in 3 red states, Nebraska, Idaho, and Utah, that would expand Medicaid under Obamacare. And in Kansas, voters elected a Democratic governor who actually replaced a Republican who had prevented the expansion of Medicaid that was supported by Republicans in the state legislature. So I think it's the states where we'll probably see a single payer as a proving ground. So probably not so much nationally, at least yet.
I think Tim made an intriguing point about Laura now being the new insurance commissioner. It'll be interesting to see how he defends the interest of the insurance industry, because as you know, if single payer is in California, insurance goes away. If you don't need insurance and the state is now the only payer, why need insurance? So it'll be interesting to me how he defends that position and the balancing act that he'll need to make. Here's a question for Carrie. One of the few California victories for the free market on Tuesday was a rejection of Prop 10, the rent control initiative. But it's likely that this will not be the end of the story. So Carrie, you've written about the rent control in various communities like Sacramento and Los Angeles County at the local level. What's next in the push for rent control after the defeat of Prop 10? What does it mean for the future of housing legislation at the Capitol?
It got rejected, and it got rejected hard. There was nothing close about it. Nobody can say, well, maybe next time voters will change that. So I think as an issue, it's going to cool for a while. I could be wrong. I'm willing to be wrong about anything I say on any of these podcasts, but that's my feeling at the moment. That it's going to cool down as an issue. Because it was rejected, that doesn't mean that our housing crisis is suddenly going to get better. It's just going to keep it from getting worse, which Prop 10 would have taken something that was a sore spot and really rubbed sandpaper the wound, shall we say. Nothing is really going to happen as far as housing crisis being relieved in this state until Sacramento makes some profound changes, which it seems incapable of doing. But it's going to have to start with CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act. That's going to have to be not reformed, it's going to be overhauled. And until that happens, there will be no building spike that what we need to keep the crisis in check and to reverse it. And if I don't see it ever happening, it's not going to happen soon. There's going to be no changes. We've talked about third rails in certain political areas. I would say CEQA might be one in California.
So Tim, while we're still waiting the final outcome of a few races, it's clear that the Democrats have strengthened their already strong hand in the legislature. What can we expect in the coming months from an emboldened Democratic supermajority? Is there any hope for the free market following Tuesday's drubbing for legislative Republicans?
Well, right now, the Democrats have gained 2 seats in the state assembly, and they've gained 2 seats in the state senate, and there's a potential that they could gain as many as 2 more in the state assembly. So if you're looking at Republicans having what's that, 10 or 11 seats in the Senate and 21 or 22 seats in the assembly, don't expect that any Republican authored legislation is going to move very far. This past legislative session was marked by the extreme progressive left pushing hard against the establishment left on some of these priorities like privacy and net neutrality and single-payer health care, for example. And I think that, you can expect some of that is going to continue. But for a lot of these issues, the wiser hands, the cooler heads prevailed, if you will. And I think on issues like single-payer, you're likely to see that continue at least for the short term. Where you could get some free market advancement at play could be, will the legislature come up with a reasonable compromise on the Dynamex decision on independent contractors? That's something where, the left will want to carry the water for the unions, but really as a practical matter, it would be very destructive for California's economy. The legislature almost has to come up with a free market, hands-off approach to independent contractors. So I think you could see, and it cuts across party lines, and the tech industry, which is a strong supporter of Democrats these days, really wants these changes. So I think that you could see a free market solution on that particular issue. But otherwise, don't expect too much in terms of cutting taxes and regulations and avoiding big government proposals. California, the next 2 years is going to be kind of the mirror opposite of what Congress has done the last 2 years.
Here's one for Ben. We know you've been following the results in your home state of Connecticut and other states around the country. What one result from outside of California interest do you think will impact free market policies the most, either positively or negatively?
Sure. Well, on the national side, looking positively, I guess, if you're a free marketeer, the Republican gains in the Senate mean that Democrats will certainly have a hard time preventing the confirmation of judges who adhere to a more originalist approach to interpreting the Constitution. And there are going to be a lot of important federal cases related to property rights and free speech, where the confirmation of these types of judges will certainly make a difference. Looking at the states, I think the results in Florida are interesting because Governor-elect Ron DeSantis is a pretty strong free marketeer and a pretty vocal advocate for school choice. So it'll be interesting to see how his leadership impacts the direction of the state. And I think conservatives nationally will be looking to Florida, where the state is currently controlled by Republicans in the state house, and to prove that pro-growth economic policies and school choice really work.
Ben, I wanted to pick up on something that you said earlier that I thought was interesting, and that was about the messaging on taxes in California. It seemed nationally in the races for the House and the Senate, at least, that the tax cuts were not, it was mixed at best. It wasn't really a slam dunk win for Republicans on the tax cuts and, in broader sense, the economy. I know that, California voters voted to continue this massive gas tax increase when they rejected Prop 6, yet we had mixed messages on these different local tax measures. Ro, I know you've written about a lot of these tax issues at the state and local level. What do you think Tuesday's results say about the future for tax reform in California, and especially as we look ahead to a potential measure on split roll property tax that could be coming in November 2020?
Yeah, Tim, it's unfortunate that our best chance to get tax reform was with Governor Brown. You might remember that back in the day, Art Laffer helped him put together his flat tax proposal for when he ran for president. So Brown knew the history of California's famous booms and busts and how tax reform would have helped smooth out tax revenues for the state, but he didn't do anything about it. He could have been much bolder, and so he's turned out to be a big disappointment in that area. I don't think we'll see tax reform anytime soon. But, tax hikes, well, I think that's another matter. The California electorate approved Prop 6, but frankly, I agree with you, Tim, that I think the wording was kind of confusing for voters. And as far as the split roll property tax, and that's the measure that will remove the protections of Prop 13 from commercial and industrial properties, I can see down the line voters in favor of that since it doesn't affect individual taxes. But I think the key question is, whether a recession is around the corner. It doesn't look that way now, given that unemployment is at historical lows, but we are seeing signs of businesses slowing. And also don't forget that the SALT state and local tax deduction limitations are in place in 2018, and voters might not be so happy in April when their taxes are due. And then don't forget that there's also the tax measures that I think were in ballots in more than 100 local elections, either sales taxes or bond measures. So voters are being taxed quite a bit. So this time next year, I think voters might feel overly taxed. And if we start to see the economy unravel, you might see voters hold the line this time. at least for individual taxes. So let's turn to the gubernatorial race. It's no surprise that Gavin Newsom was elected as governor of California. Despite his carefully crafted image as a pro-business moderate, many expect a shift in both style and policy direction. What can we expect from the first 100 days of Newsom as governor? How different do you expect Newsom compared with Brown? Carrie, you want to take that?
At the beginning, he's going to be more of the tail, and I think the legislators or the Democrats in the Assembly and in the Senate are going to be the dog wagging him. I think he's not an outsider by any means, but I think he needs to build up a little more political capital before he can start really pushing his agenda. I've said this earlier. I think he's Brown was sort of the adult in the room, I think, with this group in Sacramento. I think it's going to be less so with Newsom. I think it's going to be, as I said before, I think he's going to continue deepening the blue of the state more than Brown would. Not to say that Brown was even a centrist, but I think that Newsom is a good bit farther left, and is going to take the state deeper blue.
Tim, want to take that?
Well, I think it's more than Brown was the adult in the room. I think now that Brown is moving off to stage left, it's like the kids are being left home alone with no parent. And I think that, it is inevitable that this legislature, who has much more of a liberal bent than even Jerry Brown, has a lot of pent-up demands of things that he rejected for one reason or another. And they're going to push on him. It's inevitable that a legislature will test the limits of a new governor. That being said, he's as far left as they are. So I think they will be, simpatico on a lot of major issues. It just comes down to a question of priorities. Are the priorities that Gavin Newsom lays out for his first year and first legislative session going to jive with what the Democrats want to do? And particularly this will be the case on the budget. The governor-elect is being left with something like a $12 billion rainy day fund. Now, we know as soon as we have the next downturn, that money will be gone in a flash. But will Newsom and the legislature resist the temptation to spend that money? I doubt it. And I predict some of that money will be spent for new big government programs in the coming year. Will Gavin Newsom say no to creating ongoing programs with one-time money? Jerry Brown was a line in the sand on that. I don't know if we can expect the same of Gavin Newsom. I'd say in the first 100 days, I think you're going to see a lot of self-adulation on the part of Gavin Newsom. There'll be a lot of patting himself on the back. There'll be a lot of speeches. There'll be a lot of him, kind of lecturing to people. There'll be a lot of talk. And then I think we'll get down to work, after the glow has worn off. But certainly you can expect Gavin Newsom is someone who has never resisted a microphone. He'll be up and down the state and doing media interviews and promoting himself like no other governor in recent time.
Anything to add, Ben?
I think it's too early to tell. I think Newsom walks a fine line between being a progressive and a business moderate or a pragmatist. I think it will probably depend upon the issue itself. He said in interviews that his major issues are higher education, workforce development, and early childhood education. And I think those are not necessarily the high-profile single-payer type issues that Democrats would probably like him to rally around. But I think it's probably where he'll be the most progressive of all.
So as we close Campaign 2018 may finally be over, but Campaign 2020 is just starting. So several Californians are potential presidential contenders in 2020, including Senator Kamala Harris, Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti, billionaire and liberal activist Tom Steyer, attorney Michael Avenatti, and maybe even Jerry Brown. So looking at the potential field, who do you think is the strongest possible contender from the Golden State?
I'll jump in on that one because I believe I jumped in on the first question of the podcast. So I'm going to go with Garcetti. I feel compared to all the others, even Brown included, he seems more polished. He seems less of a threat than the others. He doesn't come off as a hand grenade with a pin pulled out of it. He's going to appear more trustworthy than the others. Level-headed, cooler-headed, I believe, as Tim used that phrase earlier about in the podcast. And I think he's not going to show up as someone who has an axe to grind like the rest of them do. I don't want to say they're single-issue candidates. That's not the case. But I think they're all more limited in what their persona is going to cast out there to the public. So I'm going to go with Garcetti as being the most acceptable among that group, at least on the national level.
Tim?
Carrie, I think you're right as far as Garcetti. I think there's two different contests at play here. Number one is who has the stamina and the grit and the staying power to go the whole way and win the nomination. And then the second question is who is the best candidate from the Democratic side to potentially fight against Trump. In the general election, in my mind, there's no question that Eric Garcetti would be a really strong, attractive general election candidate against Trump. He's say what you will about him, but he ticks a lot of boxes. He has a record that you could spin in a very attractive way, and a mayor is an executive, and usually when you're electing a president, you're looking for someone with executive experience. Just ask the executive of all time, Donald Trump. But I don't think he has the stamina to win the Democratic primary. I think his fellow Californian Kamala Harris has that. They love her in the very far left crowds. She can raise the money. She can, in a lesser way, but she has some of the same Obama magic for Democrat left-wing crowds. And I think the idea of being an African-American woman is very appealing to a lot in the left-wing base. And I could see her giving any of these other Democrats talking about running a run for their money for the nomination, not for the general election. Trump would love to run against such as a Kamala Harris in the general election.
I will say one thing of the comparison to Obama, I think is very apt, except in one area. She comes off as very angry, and that's one thing Obama generally didn't come off as, even when the times he became rather obnoxious. But he didn't come off as an angry person. From my standpoint, she does. She seems like she has a real chip on her shoulder. And again, I said that Garcetti doesn't seem to have an axe to grind. She does, and I don't know how that's going to play. I wouldn't think that would play well in the other 49 states.
And that's why I say she is the one for the primary, because that's what they want to hear is anger and screaming and fist shaking, but not in a general election.
I don't think that there are really any candidates out there. I think you really need to consider someone who has the ability to go toe-to-toe with President Trump, but who also appeals to more moderate voters and the working class. And I don't think that there's anyone in California out there now who currently fits the bill.
Well, anyway, I've got a candidate that's completely out of the box, but fits all of your criteria, everything that's been mentioned here. Grit, star power, sex appeal, ran an empire, from California, African-American, Oprah. I think she's the only Democrat out there who's got the stature and the appeal that could actually beat Trump. And since this tradition of having a professional politician run for president, is gone away thanks to Trump being elected, then I think you're going to see a lot of other people out of the box, celebs like Oprah, billionaires like Tom Steyer, and others that we don't know is out there that might be interested in running and could potentially out-Trump Trump. Thanks to our listeners for joining us, and for a national perspective on the election. Next week, we'll be joined by Clark Judge, chairman of PRI and founder of the White House Writers Group. Thanks, everyone.